We want to thank you for joining our after-hour session of MasterClass. Today we're joined with Steve Brown, who is the Executive Director of Arrow Leadership. And we've just had a great opportunity to spend time with Steve as he taught us about discipleship and about the priority and the importance and how we can seek to draw that out in our own life and into the lives of other people. Steve and I have the privilege today of being joined by Brandon Thompson, pastor at Embertide Church in Hampton. We're joined by Bob Knowles, who is the Vice President of Development at Crandall University. And we're also joined with Dan Pike. Dan is our Youth and Family Director for the Canadian Baptists of Atlantic Canada. And it's really great to have the three of them join us because each of you have been involved in Arrow leadership in the past. And it's great to be able to have you join us in this conversation around discipleship. And so, as I said earlier, we've just had the privilege of being together in a session with Steve on this. And so we want to take it a little bit deeper. Steve, it's great to have you join us, though.
Yeah, it's so good to be back and to be with these three gentlemen and to be speaking into pastors in Atlantic Canada.
Great. What we want to do is we just want to delve a little bit deeper into what hit you, Dan, Bob, and Brandon as something that you hadn't heard before. Maybe that's where we'll start. And so maybe, Dan, let's start with you. What did Steve say today that you sat back and you just kind of thought, I hadn't really thought of that before, but that's great.
Yeah, I mean, there was so much gold in Steve's content today, and just really appreciated it. I think one of the pieces that really just jumped out at me was there was a graph that Steve showed about the downward trajectory of weekly church attendance in Canada, and kind of as the trajectory goes, we're heading towards a negative church attendance rate in the early 2030s, and that graph just really grabbed my attention, jumped out at me, and it was striking, alarming, but it was a helpful kind of picture of our reality here in Canada. Yeah,
Steve, as a leader of Arrow, when you first came across that information, as you hear Dan raise that, how does that help shape you in your thinking with leaders today?
Yeah, the graph comes from a kind of a bringing together all the major studies of weekly church attendance since 1946, where 67% of Canadians were going every week. In 2016, that 67% had gone down to 11%, and then you just extrapolate that forward, and it's, as Dan said, gets into negative territory. So that's weekly church attendance. That doesn't mean people aren't coming once a week or twice a month or those kinds of things. But what it does challenge us is the come to us model needs to be reimagined. Because people are not coming to us weekly anymore. And so how are we going to reimagine ways to disciple people, ways to get people in community, ways to see lives transformed? So I think we're liable to make lots of mistakes trying to figure this out. But those mistakes, if we learn fast and learn well, will set us on a better pathway to impact people's lives.
Oh, yeah, it's important. Bob, what about for you? What stood out, or that you kind of thought, I hadn't thought about that before?
Well, I just want to follow up a bit on that graph. And I guess the idea is that I wonder if Steve would comment on whether he thinks that, there's still a few days that are missing on the end of that, like what has happened recently that will impact the, weekly attendance and so on. And we know it's changed to weekly online versus weekly in person and things like that. But I wonder about some of the bigger issues that, say, we in Canada have been watching or, that have come to us through media and so on. So I can think of a few, obviously COVID, but, the issue of on the news about residential schools and also about racism and things like that. So I wonder how that has impacted the church's message to people who maybe have already objected to faith, and if that has put a bigger barrier there or something new for us to overcome They've seen the division of Christians. They've wondered where God is with some of these big issues. I don't know if you want to comment on that, Steve. They're huge issues, right? But the church, are people looking to the church or away from the church? Or I guess that's my question. So.
Yeah, so there was a recent national study done. It was on global TV, and you can Google it. And one of the outcomes of the study was that more Canadians believe that evangelical Christian faith is a detriment to society than a benefit to society. So that's I think the first time in Canadian history of polls, at least, where more everyday Canadians think that the term, at least, evangelical Christian is a bad thing for Canada versus a good thing for Canada. And maybe it's the words, maybe it's US media overflow into Canada. I hope that they wouldn't think the local church on their street, or at the corner is a bad thing for Canada. I'm hopeful. I hope there's a misunderstanding there. I hope that when you put it on the grassroots, it's no, I love that church at the end of the street. But there is a general kind of shaking of the head at the church from at least people who wouldn't call themselves Christians. So that'd be one thing. And then I think even during COVID, I found that the church wasn't even consulted a lot of the time by government entities. And so in a sense, we're not on the radar in one sense. So how do we, on the corner where your church is, how do we create a positive image? How do we be light in a place that isn't sure what we do, who we are, if we're even good for the community? Those questions are ones we need to be wrestling with. The answers don't come easy. Again, we probably make lots of mistakes trying to figure out how to respond, but again, we'd better get responding.
Thanks for that, Steve. Brandon, what about you? What did you hear Steve say today that just made you sit back and go, okay, I hadn't thought about that here in our context?
Yeah, so for me, it was almost like a toss-away statement, and it was something that kind of clicked in my brain that Steve said was talking about competing commitments. And he just talked about how, like, there are, like, understanding, and it made me stop for a second and just think, what are my competing commitments for discipleship? And what are the things that are getting in my way that I may even not be conscious of that are stopping me from really living out the Great Commission? And I think if we all stopped and took stock, there'd probably be quite a few. And I wonder, Steve, if you could name what's the biggest one, do you think that would be a competing commitment for churches and ministers and leaders in discipleship? What do you think that one will be?
Yeah, the idea of competing commitments, I first heard of it through a book called Immunity to Change by some folks from Harvard. And the idea that they came up with is that change is really, really hard. And people don't change even when they know the change is good for them. And there's lots of studies out there. There's studies of heart patients who know that the medicine they've been prescribed is actually going to save their lives, but they don't take it. Within 3 months, they're not taking it as prescribed. And it seems like craziness, right? Like they know it's good for them and they won't do it. So this idea of competing commitments is get to the root issue of what are you doing or not doing that's actually undermining your desire or your intention to move forward in an area. So that's kind of where we always run short on New Year's resolutions, right? Yes, I want to be in better health this year. I'm not going to eat junk food, but by kind of January 10th, I'm there with a bag of potato chips. So what's the competing commitments? Because I know potato chips aren't good for me. I know kale is better. So mental assent, but underneath something's undermining it. So what's actually working against it? So to apply that to discipleship, and I'd love for everybody to respond to this. I think sometimes I think Sundays actually is a competing commitment to discipleship. Which sounds heretical possibly, but in terms of making Sunday great, sometimes we aren't praying for Sunday. Sometimes we're so focused on what happens on the stage that we're not thinking about, how's that filtering into the pews, and how's that lived out in the foyer, or we forget sometimes that people are actually trying to apply this Monday to Saturday, what we talk about on Sunday, and the disconnect sometimes for us of like Monday to Saturday in people's lives can mean it doesn't speak to where they're at Wednesday trying to make payroll, and all the fears and anxiety that that business person in our church is dealing with on Wednesday. And they didn't see any connection to what happened on Sunday. So those would be some initial thoughts. I think our busyness of just being pulled, pastors being pulled in so many different directions, expectations being so high, that actually doing life on life, doesn't happen, or happens a lot less than we imagined it would back when we were in seminary.
It's a lot to think about and chew on there in terms of understanding our competing commitments in our own lives. Yeah, it's great. It's good. Let's kind of look now to kind of what was gold, like what was, ultra value that Steve said that just made you go, oh, that is going to be beneficial down the road. Let's circle back the other way. Brandon, maybe you can start that off for us.
Yeah, I think for me, it was the story that you shared about Evan. I think that for me is always, I remember you sharing that at Arrow, and it was just a really life-changing story. I know just for me and my wife as well. And one of the things that I'm finding the most challenging when it comes to discipling, carrying out the Great Commission, is the gap of common values that I have with the people around me. So I'm just finding to find common ground with people anymore is often very difficult. And when we do start having conversations trying to build common ground, it usually ends up devolving into like discussions around abortion or, gender and all that kind of stuff. And it becomes like a huge, big problem. But what I love about what you shared with those 6 points was that you can overcome like those gender or like those big gaps in common values that people might have through those 6 points. And then I think you get to like the 6 point. I like, to me, that was just like, yes, we got to remember to do that again. And I think in our churches too, we kind of just jump. We got to go right to like the gospel track or whatever when we're discipling people, and we forget about those first verses. So of course people are terrified. Like they're gonna, like the people around them are gonna look like they've got 3 heads if they start talking about the 5 spiritual laws or whatever it is, right? So I found that so helpful again to remind myself and so I can remind our people here at church, just like it needs to start at a deeper but at a simpler level, than what we think discipleship is. We have to reframe it altogether.
Those 6 things, just real quick: seeing people, loving people, praying for people, modeling it out ourselves, encouraging people, and then teaching. And I mean, it starts with, do I even see the person at the gas station who takes my debit card today? Lord, give me eyes to see them.
Yeah. Bob, what about for you? What did you hear that is gold?
I don't know that it was new. It's just a great reminder about in those 6 statements. I think the modeling one always stands out because, I mean, it really comes down to that is authenticity and, you are the real deal. I mean, but I think people need to see us I think part of the objection that people have sometimes to faith is that people let them down. Professional Christians or church leaders, and I mean, even we as church leaders on the discipleship journey kind of get a bit disillusioned with our own brothers and sisters sometimes, but how do we have the maturity to see beyond that you can't, we are broken and we do struggle, and yet you can't paint everyone with the same brush, necessarily to say, yeah, we do fail and fall, but that doesn't mean that every Christian is a failure or has fallen, or that you discount Jesus because we fail. So it's hard to get people to look beyond the struggles, and especially the ones that get more, airtime in the news and things. So I guess, I was thinking about a course that I taught about a year ago, and this guy came into the course and said, "I hate Christians." That was his lead off. And by the end of the course, he said, "I still hate Christians, but I like my professor." So at least if I was able to kind of bring him down a notch, a little bit more light than heat, then I thought that you start to at least get to a point where you can talk. And we've got to somehow take the heat off of this, so at least we can start to build bridges and relationships. So I think modeling is huge, and I guess that would be my takeaway from that list.
Love that image of building bridges, and that we're bridge building as we pastor, as we shepherd, as we lead. And sometimes that's slow work. So good on you, Bob, for modeling that through a course for a year, and knowing that he might have been rolling or she might have been rolling their eyes as you taught at times, but you modeled it out. And yeah, I think for an unbelieving world, that's part of the deal. And how do we model it out? How do we keep pointing people to Jesus? How do we keep building bridges? How do we keep praying? It's just slow obedience in the same direction, to borrow from Eugene Peterson.
Yeah, and what about you? What did you pocket today as gold?
Yeah, I'm gonna circle back to the same comments as Brandon and Bob here. Like when I think about these 6 points that Steve shared with his relationship with Evan, who invested so much, for me, my heartbeat is next generation ministry, youth and children's ministry, right? And so as a youth pastor for a long time now in this denominational role, and as a dad, I want to see my kids come to know Jesus too. And having people who see my kids, who know them, who encourage them, who model the faith for them, that is so much more valuable than any program that a church will offer. And so, I think if we had churches full of Evans, people who were investing in our youth and our children, that would be a huge win. And so I would just love to, see these values, see these principles played out in a much wider scale. As churches come out of the pandemic, they're often asking, how do we get our volunteers back? How do we get our programs back up and running? And I don't think that's the answer. I think the answer is how do we cultivate more Evans in our churches?
I've shared that list, Evan's six things, which are Paul's 6 things, which are Jesus' 6 things, with lots of different people. And I've asked them, can you do these things? And they kind of look at him and go, I think I can. I think I can see people. I think I can love people. I think I can pray. I'm not perfect, but I can live out my faith. I think I can be an encourager. And I think there's some things I could share. And sometimes I think people are freaked out by I've got to have it all together. I got to have all these skills and everything. When they're already doing a lot of these things, and maybe they could just turn it up a little bit, be a bit more intentional.
Yeah, that's so good. For me, as I was listening to you today, there were a number of things that I just kind of thought, so much value in that. And certainly Evan's story, of course, for Dan, Bob, and Brandon, that they've heard it before. So for those of us who would have heard it for the first time, it was that's such a great model of being able to hang our lives on in terms of how to live it out. But Steve, one of the things that stood out for me, that I just kind of thought, thank you for the reminder, is what I was thinking when I heard it. And that was when you talked about Lazarus, and you talked about the fact that only God could have done that. That there was no way that anybody else could do that. And in some way, for us, when I look at our culture and I look at the future of the church, there's a level where we can fervently try to pour so much of our energy, so much of our effort, time, and skill into something and it not come to fruition. And similarly, Lazarus' family or his other friends could not bring him back from death. And that it was only something that God could do. And I think it's such a simple but powerful reminder that we need to really trust in the sovereignty of God. and to work with that, because then I love the picture of, it was his family and his friends who took off the grave clothes. Like, they had work to do in the process of the transformation, but the ignition of that transformation, it's only God could do that. And so for me, that was gold. Like, that was something that I just pocketed, and I thought, oh, such a good reminder for whether you're a local church leader, whether you're a denominational leader, a school leader, or an institute leader like yourself with Arrow, that really God can only do this, and we can be a part of it, but we've really got to depend and trust in him. So thank you for that. Really appreciated it.
Thanks, Garth. And I'm praying more now for revival in our churches and spiritual awakening in Canada than I have in all my Christian life, because we're up against some things that we're not smart enough to overcome. We're not going to, work enough to overcome on our own. We still got to bring our best, but victory does rest with the Lord, as Proverbs 21:31 says, and he's able to do more than we can ask or imagine by his power at work within us. That's something I think for all of us. Sometimes revival gets it seems like there should be a tent and it should be 1930 or something when we use the word revival, but I think we got to be praying for it, and may we see more than we could ask or imagine.
Amen. Well, Steve, thank you again so much for taking the time to be with us, and even to go a little extra time with this podcast. Greatly appreciated. And Dan and Bob and Brandon, thank you for sticking around and your contributions also. And so for those of you who are listening, downloading this later, thanks for taking the time to give us a few more minutes of your day. Take care.